She gave her eyes to the blind alien. Prince then woke seeing through stars. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. In the sterile medical ward of the Galactic Concordance flagship, Emily Parker scrubbed blood from her hands, her own blood, though she could no longer see the crimson swirls disappearing down the drain. The young human nurse had just made a decision that would be recorded in 17 different alien languages, debated in councils across 40 systems, and ultimately changed the fundamental understanding of what humanity was capable of sacrificing. The water ran cold against her skin, and she felt the smooth texture of the surgical soap between her fingers, committing every tactile sensation to memory, since touch would soon be all she had left. 3 cycles earlier, Emily had been nobody special, just another human working the medical bays on Concordance Station 7, patching up diplomats and translators who got a little too enthusiastic during cross-species negotiations. The station orbited a binary star system in neutral space, a massive construct of steel and composite materials that housed over 200,000 beings from 83 different species. It was a place where cultures collided, where the impossible became routine, where a human from Earth could share a meal with a methane-breathing Threxian or debate philosophy with a hive mind collective from the outer reaches. Emily had arrived at the station 4 years ago, fresh from nursing school on Earth, witty and eager to make a difference in the galaxy. She had been warned that working in Zen medicine was challenging, that the stress of treating physiologies she barely understood would break her, that most human nurses washed out within a year. But Emily had proven them wrong. She was good at her job, patient and kind, with a gift for making even the most bizarre alien physiologies feel comfortable under her care. Her supervisor, a crystalline being named Shards of Morning Light, often said Emily had the rarest quality in the galaxy: genuine compassion that crossed species barriers. Shards was not exaggerating. Emily had a knack for understanding what her patients needed, even when they could not communicate it clearly. She learned to read the color shifts in Valyrian skin, the harmonic frequencies in Melodian speech, the scent markers that canids used to express pain. She studied xenobiology in her off hours, not because it was required, but because she wanted to be better, to help more effectively. Her quarters were filled with medical texts in a dozen languages, cultural guides to proper bedside manner for species that had never even heard of beds, and personal notes on the quirks and preferences of her regular patients. The medical bay was Emily's domain, sprawling complex of treatment rooms designed to accommodate the wildly varying needs of concordant species. There were high-pressure chambers for deep-sea dwellers, zero-gravity rooms for species that had never evolved on planets, radiation-shielded cells for beings that fed on stellar energy, and standard atmospheric wards for the humanoid majority. Emily worked primarily in the latter, though she was cross-trained for emergencies in almost every section. The day the Valerie delegation arrived, Emily was finishing a double shift. She had been on her feet for 16 hours, treating everything from a Threxian suffering from atmospheric poisoning to a young canid who had gotten into a fight over territory disputes in the residential sector. She was exhausted, her back ached, and she Was looking forward to a hot shower and 10 hours of sleep when Shards found her. In the staff lounge, the crystalline supervisor was vibrating at a frequency Emily had learned to recognize as excitement mixed with anxiety. The light refracted through Shards' faceted body in patterns that almost looked like words in the crystalline language, though. Emily's translator focused on the actual vocalizations. Shard said urgently, "Emily, I need you in Bay 12 immediately. VIP arrival, delicate situation, your skills are required." Emily set down her coffee, a bitter human brew that most aliens found incomprehensible. "Who is it?" she asked, already mentally preparing for whatever exotic medical needs might be coming her way. Shards' light patterns shifted to something Emily recognized as diplomatic caution. Valerie and royal family, Prince Kael of the 7th house. The medical brief is classified, but I was told to assign best to his care. That's you. Emily felt a flutter of nervousness. She had never treated Valyrian royalty before, had barely treated any Valorans at all. The species kept largely to themselves. Their ancient empire spanning 12 core systems, but rarely engaging with concordance politics beyond the minimum required for trade agreements. They were known for their advanced technology, their complex culture, and their extreme privacy when it came to internal affairs. "What's his condition?" Emily asked, pulling up the medical base systems on her personal data pad. Shard's crystals dimmed slightly. "That's the classified part. I wasn't given details, only that he requires long-term medical supervision and that the situation is politically sensitive. The delegation specifically requested a human caregiver, which is unusual given Valerie and preferences for their own physicians." Emily raised an eyebrow. "They requested a human specifically." Shards chimed in affirmative. "Apparently, there's a medical compatibility issue that makes human caregivers preferable. I don't understand the details, but the request came through proper diplomatic channels. Will you take the assignment?" Emily was already moving toward Bay 12. "Of course," she said. "That's what I'm here for." The Valyrian delegation arrived without the fanfare that should have accompanied royalty. No honor guards, no diplomatic procession, just 3 figures in flowing robes that shimmered like liquid starlight moving quickly through the medical bay's private entrance. 2 were clearly attendants, their posture differential, their movements precise and coordinated. The 3rd figure walked between them, one hand on each attendant's shoulder, guided rather than leading. That was Emily's first clue that something was deeply wrong. The Valorans were tall, elegant beings with skin that shimmered like oil on water, faces that seemed almost human, but with features too perfect, too symmetrical to be anything but alien. Their eyes, Emily had read, were their most striking feature, large and multifaceted, capable of perceiving spectrums of light that most species could not even detect. Those eyes held galaxies within them. People said depths of color and perception that made Valyrian art the most prized in the known universe. Prince Kael of the 7th house had his eyes covered with a silver cloth. Emily felt her medical training kick in, overriding her curiosity and nervousness. She approached with the calm professionalism that had made her one of the station's top nurses, her voice gentle but clear. She said, "Your Highness, I'm Emily Parker. I'll be your primary care nurse during your stay. Welcome to Concordance Station 7. If you'll follow me, we have a private suite prepared where we can conduct your initial medical assessment. Prince's head turned toward her voice. His attendants tensed clearly. Protective, but Cale raised a hand in a gesture that Emily's cultural database tagged as Valyrian for stand on. His voice was melodic, each word precisely articulated with an accent that turned human English into something almost musical. Nurse Parker, he said, thank you for your courtesy. I apologize for the irregular arrival. My condition makes public appearances uncomfortable. Emily gestured toward the private suite, then remembered he could not see the motion and said, no apologies necessary, Your Highness. We're here to help. The suite is 20 paces forward and to your left. She watched as Cale counted the steps, his attendants hovering anxiously but allowing him to navigate independently. It was clear this was not a new routine. He had been doing this for a long time. The medical suite was designed for long-term patients who required privacy. Combination of hospital room and luxury apartment. Emily had personally overseen its preparation, ensuring that all medical equipment was state-of-the-art, but concealed behind panels, making the space feel more like a residence than a clinical environment. There were diagnostic scanners built into the walls, nanite medical systems in the air, filtration, and enough computing power to run full-body analyses without the patient ever knowing they were being monitored. Cale's attendants, who introduced themselves as Shimmer and Radiance, names that Emily's translator rendered from complex musical phrases, began the formal medical briefing. They were professional but clearly uncomfortable, their skin colors shifting through patterns that Emily's cultural database identified as deep concern and embarrassment. Shimmer, the taller of the two attendants, spoke in formal cadence. Prince Cale was born with a congenital defect affecting his optical neural pathways. Among our people, such conditions are so rare as to be nearly mythical. Our medical science advanced past genetic defects millennia ago. The prince's condition is an anomaly, a mutation that occurred despite all preventative measures. Radiance continued, speaking in harmonized tones with Shimmer in a way that suggested they had delivered this speech many times before. We have exhausted every treatment option available to Valyrian medicine: cloning techniques, synthetic replacements, neural rerouting, quantum reconstruction. Nothing has proven compatible with His Highness's unique physiology. The optical structure of a Valyrian is impossibly complex, woven through with quantum-sensitive cells that perceive not just light but electromagnetic fields, radiation spectrums, probability clouds, and dimensional fluctuations. To be blind as a Valyrian is not simply to lack sight. It is to be cut off from the fundamental way our species perceives and interacts with reality. Emily listened carefully, already pulling up Valyrian physiological data on her terminal, cross-referencing it with the specific notes the attendants were providing. She asked, so he has never had sight? Never, Shimmer confirmed. The neural pathways never developed properly in Udero. By the time the defect was discovered, it was too late for corrective measures. Prince Cale has lived his entire life in sensory isolation from his own people. Emily looked at Cale, who sat quietly during this discussion, his silver face covering reflecting the soft lights of The medical suite. She asked gently. Your Highness, may I ask you some questions directly? Cale tilted his head toward her. Of course, nurse. Parker, I'm the patient after all. My attendants sometimes forget that I am present during discussions of my condition. There was no bitterness in his voice, just a quiet observation that made Emily like him immediately. She pulled up a chair, sitting at what she judged to be a comfortable conversational distance. How do you navigate spaces? She asked. I noticed you counted steps. Do you use other sensory cues? Cale and LT Unk and GT's expression shifted, and even with the face covering, Emily could sense something like appreciation in his posture. Perceptive question, he said. Yes, I count steps and memorize layouts. I also use sound reflection, echolocation in a crude sense, though not as effective as species that evolved with it. I can sense electromagnetic fields to some degree. All Valorans can, though my ability is underdeveloped compared to those with functional optical systems. And I learned to recognize individuals by their movement patterns, voice, even the subtle electromagnetic signature that each being produces. Emily made notes, already thinking about how to make his environment more navigable. Can you sense me now? She asked. Cale turned his head slightly, as if focusing. Yes, he said. You are approximately 1.8 m tall, seated in a chair 2 meters from me. Your heart rate is slightly elevated, probably from the long shift my attendants mentioned you just completed. You move with economy. No wasted motion, which suggests medical training and probably military or athletic background, and you smell like human coffee and antiseptic soap, which tells me you are recently off duty, but came directly here without stopping to change. Emily felt a chill of surprise. That's remarkable, she said. You gathered all that without seeing me. Cale and LT Unk and GT's lips curved in what might have been a smile. I have lived 32 years, learning to perceive the universe through inadequate senses. Nurse Parker, you develop compensatory skills when the primary ones are absent. But to answer your unasked question, no, it is not enough. I can navigate, I can function, but I am isolated in ways that you cannot imagine. For my people's sight is communication, art, culture, connection. I am forever an outsider among my own species, unable to participate in the most basic social interactions, unable to perceive the beauty that defines Valyrian civilization. The words were matter-of-fact, not self-pitying, which somehow made them more devastating. Emily felt her heart clench with professional sympathy that was rapidly becoming something more personal. She said, I'm going to do everything I can to help you during your stay here, Your Highness. Whatever medical options exist, we'll explore them. Shimmer and Radiance exchanged looks, their skin colors shifting through patterns of skepticism. They had heard such promises before. Emily realized they had no reason to believe this human nurse could achieve what Valerie and medical science could not. But Emily was already thinking, already planning, already determined to prove them wrong. She learned his story in pieces between medical scans and frustrated consultations with Valyrian physicians who spoke in musical tones that her translators struggled to interpret. Cale had been born with a genetic defect virtually unknown among his people. His optical nerves had never developed properly, leaving him in perpetual darkness since birth. For a species that communicated as much through subtle color shifts in their skin and eyes as through words. Blindness was not just a disability, it was a devastating isolation. The Valorans had exhausted every medical option their advanced civilization could offer. Cloning techniques, synthetic replacements, neural rerouting, nothing worked with their unique physiology. The optic structure of a Valoran was impossibly complex, woven through with quantum sensitive cells that perceived not just light but electromagnetic fields, radiation spectrums humans did not even have names for. It was not just about seeing, it was about perceiving reality in dimensions that most species could not imagine. Emily found herself drawn to the prince during her shifts. Despite his attendant's protests, Kale insisted on walking the medical bay corridors, learning the space through touch and sound. She watched him trace his long fingers along the walls, counting steps, building mental maps. He never complained, never showed frustration, but she could sense the loneliness that surrounded him like a field. One evening she found him alone in the observation deck, his face turned toward the viewport, even though he could not see the stars beyond. Then Emily said, "You know, I've always thought it was unfair that the most beautiful view on the station is in the hospital wing. Like the universe is taunting the patients." Kale's head turned toward her voice. His attendants had removed his face covering in private, and she saw for the first time the smooth skin where his eyes should have been just faintly indented hollows that somehow made him look more vulnerable and regal. At the same time he responded, "Nurse Parker, the young human who humans while working. Your translator does not quite capture the melody, but I find it pleasant." Emily felt her cheeks warm. She moved closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "What do you sense out there?" she asked, gesturing toward the viewport before remembering he could not see the motion. "When you face the stars." Kale tilted his head, considering emptiness. He said simply, "I feel the vibration of the ship. I sense the electromagnetic signature of the viewport's polarization field. I detect the heat differential between the interior and the cosmic void beyond. But the stars themselves, the nebulas, the dance of galaxies that my people find so beautiful, those are just concepts to me, words in the darkness." His voice held no self-pity, just a quiet statement of fact which somehow made it worse. Emily found herself speaking before thinking. "I could describe them to you." Kale and LT Unk and GT's expression shifted, a ripple of color moving across his skin that her translator helpfully informed her indicated gentle amusement. "Many have tried, Nurse Parker. The problem is not vocabulary, it is that your eyes and mine would see such different things. Valoran does not simply see color and light, we perceive the quantum foam of reality itself, the probability clouds, the fundamental forces dancing in the spaces between atoms. How could you describe what you cannot perceive?" She had no answer for that. They stood in silence for a while, an alien prince and a human nurse, both looking at stars. Only one of them could see. For Emily, that conversation became a turning point. She could not stop thinking about it, about the quiet resignation in Kale's voice, the way he had accepted his isolation as an unchangeable fact of existence. It bothered her in a way that went beyond professional concern. She had become a nurse because she believed in healing, in fixing what was broken. in refusing to accept suffering as inevitable, but here was a being whose suffering seemed truly insurmountable. Protected by the walls of biology itself, she started spending her off hours in the station's research library, a vast digital archive that contained medical journals from hundreds of species. She read about optical neurology, about the fundamental differences in how various species processed visual information, about the countless failed attempts to create artificial eyes that could truly see. She learned that vision was not just a mechanical process of light hitting receptors, it was a complex interaction between biology, physics, and consciousness that science still did not fully understand. One night, exhausted from a double shift and too much reading, Emily found herself in the medical bay's small chapel, multi-faith space designed to accommodate the spiritual needs of dozens of different species. She was not particularly religious, had not been to church since childhood, but something about the quiet peace of the place drew. Sorry. She sat in the human section, looking at the simple cross on the wall, and found herself praying for the first time in years, not for herself but for Kale, for a solution that did not exist, for a miracle in a universe that ran on physics, not faith. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, Dr. from Meridian Frost, a human xenobiologist who had been studying comparative neurology, burst into the medical director's office with data that made even the unflappable shards of morning light vibrate with what Emily had learned to recognize as excitement. Shards immediately called an emergency medical conference. The crystalline being message to Emily was tore but urgent. Drop everything. Conference room A. This concerns Prince Kale. Emily arrived to find the room already filling with medical staff. The Valyrian physicians were there, shimmer and radiance in attendance, along with several other specialists Emily recognized from previous consultations. Dr. Frost stood at the front, practically vibrating with suppressed energy, her hands moving rapidly across holographic displays that showed neural scans Emily had seen 100 times before, but arranged in ways she had never considered. Meeting was called immediately. Emily attended because she was Kale's primary care nurse, though she expected to understand perhaps one word in 10 of the technical discussion. She was pleasantly surprised when Dr. Frost began with something almost comprehensible. Frost said, "I need to start with an apology. We've been approaching this wrong from the beginning, myself included. We kept trying to rebuild Valyrian optical systems, which we now know is impossible. With current technology, their quantum perceptive cells require a level of precision we simply cannot achieve artificially. The quantum entanglement alone would require technology that won't exist for centuries, but there's another option, one that no one considered because it seemed too bizarre, too simple, and frankly too ethically problematic to seriously explore." Shards of morning light chimed, a question that the translator rendered as, "Please continue, Doctor, you have our full attention." Frost pulled up neural scans, human and Valyrian side by side, highlighting regions in pulsing colors. "Look at this," she said. "The Valyrian brain has the processing centers for vision fully developed and functional. We've known this. Prince Kale's problem is not his brain, it is the input devices, the eyes themselves, and the connecting neural pathways. His visual cortex is perfect, just waiting for data that never arrives, now human. Eyes are primitive by Valyrian standards. We see a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. We cannot perceive quantum states or probability clouds. We are essentially blind compared to what a Valoran should see. But here is the critical discovery. She zoomed in on specific neural structures, the human optic nerve and the Valyrian visual processing cortex use surprisingly similar base architecture. Not identical, not even close in capability, but the underlying quantum signatures, the fundamental frequencies at which they operate, are compatible. Ways I never expected to find. One of the Valyrian physicians, an older being, whose name Emily's translator rendered as Whisper of Ancient Wisdom, spoke with careful precision. Dr. Frost, are you suggesting that human optical organs could interface with a Valyrian neural system? That is unprecedented. Species compatibility gap alone would cause immediate rejection. Frost nodded enthusiastically. Under normal circumstances, absolutely, but we're not talking about normal circumstances. She pulled up another set of data, this time showing molecular structures and immune response patterns with concordance. Medical technology, specifically our fourth-generation immunosuppression, nanites and quantum signature matching protocols. We've performed successful cross-species organ transplants before. The technology was developed precisely for situations where compatible donors don't exist within a species. The success rate for quantum match transplants is 97% when the base neural signatures align, and in this case she highlighted specific frequencies on her display. The alignment is better than anything I've seen in cross-species matching. Emily felt a cold understanding beginning to form in her stomach, a creeping realization of where this conversation was heading. She looked at the neural scans, at the glowing pathways that represented optical processing, and felt her heart start to race. But here is where it gets really interesting, Frost continued, her voice dropping slightly as if she knew how her next words would be received. I ran a compatibility analysis on all potential donors in this sector. I checked every human on concordance. Station 7, every human within 3 jump gates, every registered human in the database within reach. There's only one match close enough to work, only one human whose quantum neural signature aligns with Prince Kael's visual processing centers at a high enough percentage to give the transplant a reasonable chance of success. Emily knew before Frost said it. Somehow looking at those scans, seeing the highlighted neural pathways that looked so hauntingly familiar, she just knew. Nurse Emily Parker, Frost said, turning to look directly at her, your neural quantum signature is the closest compatible match to Prince Kael that we found in the entire concordance database. 93% compatibility, which is extraordinary for cross-species matching. It's still not perfect. Understand, he would only receive human spectrum vision, a pale shadow of what a Valyrian should see, but it would give him sight. He would be able to perceive visible light, to see faces, to watch stars, to experience the visual world, even if it's through human limitations. The room erupted in protest. The Valerie physicians spoke over each other in cascading musical tones that Emily's translator struggled to separate into individual voices. She caught phrases like primitive organs polluting royal blood and unacceptable degradation of capability and insult to the dignity of House 7th, the Concordance medical staff were equally vocal, raising concerns about informed consent and psychological impact and the ethics of such a dramatic sacrifice for uncertain benefit. Shards of morning light vibrated through 17 different emotional frequencies in rapid succession. The crystalline beings form, refracting light in patterns that Emily had learned indicated deep internal conflict. The translator finally settled on rendering the emotion as deeply troubled consideration mixed with cautious hope. But Emily barely heard any of it. She was looking at the scans, at the highlighted sections that marked her eyes, her optic nerves, the neural pathways that let her see the universe. She was thinking about Cale standing in front of a viewport, his face turned toward stars he could only imagine, describing the emptiness he felt. She was remembering his voice when he talked about isolation, about being forever separated from his own people by the biology of his blindness. She heard herself say, as if from a great distance, "I'll do it." The room went silent. Every being present turned to look at her. The Valyrian physician's skin colors shifted through patterns of shock and disbelief. Shards of morning light went completely still, not even the faintest vibration disturbing the crystalline structure. Dr. Frost looked simultaneously relieved and horrified, as if she had not truly expected anyone to agree to what she was proposing. "Emily," Frost said carefully, slowly, "do you understand what this means? I'm talking about both eyes. We cannot do this partially. A single eye would not provide adequate visual coverage for someone who has never had sight, and the neural adaptation would be incomplete. It's both or nothing. And while we could potentially clone replacements for you, eventually grow new eyes from your own genetic material, the technology is experimental at best. Current projections suggest 3 to 5 years minimum for cloned eyes to reach viability, and that's assuming everything goes perfectly. You would be blind for years, and there's a very real possibility that we cannot get the cloning to work at all. With your specific genetic markers, you could remain blind permanently." Emily nodded slowly, feeling strangely calm, despite the enormity of what she was considering. "How long would I be blind?" she asked. "Best case scenario." "Best case," Frost said, 3 to 5 years for cloned eyes to mature to transplantation viability. During that time you would be completely without sight. Worst case, the cloning fails entirely, or your body rejects the clone tissue, or we encounter unforeseen complications. In that scenario, you remain blind for the rest of your life. One of the Valyrian physicians, Shimmer, spoke urgently in cascading tones that carried harmonics of distress and disbelief. The translator said, "This is madness. No being would sacrifice their sight for a stranger, for an alien, for someone they barely know. It is too much to ask of anyone, let alone a young human with her whole life ahead of her." Nurse Parker, with the greatest respect, you cannot possibly understand what you are offering to give up. Emily smiled, though she could feel her hands shaking where they rested on the conference table. "I'm not being asked," she said quietly. "I'm offering, and I do understand. I'm a nurse. I understand exactly what sight means, what I would be losing, but I also understand what Prince Cale would be gaining, radiance." The other Valyrian attendant spoke with a voice that trembled with emotion, even With your eyes he would not see as a Valyrian should. He would have human vision only, limited, primitive. He would go from perceiving nothing to perceiving a fraction of what his brain is designed to process. Is that truly a gift or just a different form of torment? Emily had thought about this. She had spent weeks watching Chaol navigate the station, had seen how he built mental maps and relied on sound and touch, had witnessed his quiet dignity in the face of isolation. She spoke with conviction. He would be able to see his family's faces. He would be able to watch a sunset. He would be able to look at art, to read text with his own eyes, to navigate spaces visually. Instead of counting steps, yes, it would be limited compared to Valorant capabilities, but it would be infinitely more than the nothing he has now. And, besides, she added, who are we to decide what's worth having? Shouldn't that be his choice? Whisper of ancient wisdom, spoke the elderly Valoran's voice, carrying the weight of centuries. You speak with wisdom beyond your years, young human, but I must ask the difficult question. Why would you do this for him? You have known Prince Chaol for mere weeks. You have your own life, your own dreams, your own future. Why would you give up something so precious for someone who is in the end stranger? Emily was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. Seriously, it deserved a real answer, not a platitude. Finally she said, I became a nurse because I believe that when you have the ability to help someone, when you can end suffering and you choose not to, that's a moral failure. I have spent my entire career working in Zen medicine because I believe that species boundaries shouldn't matter when it comes to compassion. Prince Chaol is suffering. He's isolated, cut off from his own people, unable to experience beauty that is fundamental to his culture, and I have the ability to change that, not completely, not perfectly, but meaningfully. How could I know that and choose to do nothing? How could I live with myself if I walked away from this? The next hour was a blur of arguments, ethical debates, and procedural discussions. The Concordance had strict protocols about this sort of thing. Informed consent requirements, mandatory psychological evaluations, waiting periods designed to ensure that donors weren't making impulsive decisions they would later regret. But Emily was adamant, and eventually the bureaucracy began to shift. The person who had been silent through all of this was Chaol himself. He had not been present for the initial meeting, had not heard Dr. Frost's proposal or Emily's immediate acceptance. When they finally brought him into the discussion, explained the possibility in detail, his first response was an immediate and absolute refusal. No, he said firmly, his skin shifting through colors that the translator labeled as absolute conviction mixed with horror. I will not accept such a sacrifice. Nurse Parker has her own life, her own dreams, her own vision of the universe. I cannot take that from her. I will not. Emily surprised herself by laughing, slightly hysterical sound that made everyone in the room turn to look at her. Your Highness, she said with respect, you don't get to make this decision for me. I'm an adult of sound mind. I'm a medical professional who fully understands the implications, and I'm offering freely. The question is not whether I'm willing, that's already settled. The question is whether you are willing to accept a gift freely given. They brought her to his private chamber for a more personal conversation away from the doctors and officials, and ethical committees, it was just the two. Of them, a human nurse who could see and a Valerie Prince who could not, sitting across from each other in a space that had become familiar over the weeks of his treatment. Kel said quietly, "Why? Please, Emily, make me understand. Why would you do this for me? You barely know me. We've had a handful of conversations. I'm nothing to you." Emily thought about that. She thought about her years working in medical, about all the beings she had cared for, about the fundamental truth that had driven her into nursing in the first place. She thought about her parents on Earth who had always taught her that the measure of a person was in how they treated those who could give them nothing in return. She thought about the view from the observation deck and Cale, standing there facing stars he could not see, and the quiet dignity he maintained in the face of loss that would have broken most beings. "Because I can," she said finally, "because you're suffering. And I have the ability to end that suffering, because I believe that compassion shouldn't have boundaries, that helping someone shouldn't require a relationship or a reason beyond the fact that they need help. Isn't that enough?" Kill was silent for a long moment. Then he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "In my culture, such a gift creates a bond that cannot be broken. If you give me your eyes, you become family. To House Seventh, a connection deeper than marriage, beyond friendship, sacred ways I cannot fully explain. You would be giving me not just sight, but incurring a debt that could never be repaid, creating an obligation that would bind our lives together forever. Do you understand that? Do you understand what you're really offering?" Emily smiled, feeling tears starting to form in her eyes. "I'm not asking for repayment," she said. "I'm not looking for obligation or bonds or sacred connections. I'm asking you to see the stars and tell me if they're as beautiful as everyone says." Kale and LT Unk and GT. Skin shifted through a dozen colors in rapid succession, emotions too complex for Emily's translator to render accurately. Finally he said, "You are the strangest being I have ever encountered, Emily Parker, and I mean that is the highest compliment." The next hour was a blur of arguments, waivers, ethical debates, and medical consultations. The concordance had strict protocols about this sort of thing: informed consent, psychological evaluation, mandatory waiting periods. But Emily was adamant, and eventually the bureaucracy began to shift. The person who had been silent through all of this was Cale himself. When they finally brought him into the discussion, explained the possibility, his first response was an immediate refusal. "No," he said firmly, the color shifts on his skin showing what the translator labeled as absolute conviction. "I will not accept such a sacrifice. Nurse Parker has her own life, her own dreams. I cannot take her sight." Emily surprised herself by laughing. "Your Highness, with respect, you don't get to make this decision for me. I'm an adult, I'm of sound mind, and I'm offering freely. Question is whether you are willing to accept." They brought her to his private chamber for the conversation, away from the doctors and officials. It was just the two of them, a human nurse who could see and a Valerie and Prince who could not. Kill said, "Why? Why would you do this for me? You barely know me." Emily thought about that. She thought about her years working in medical, about all the beings she had cared for, about the fundamental truth that had driven her into nursing in the first place. "Because I can," she said finally. "Because you're suffering and I have the ability to end that suffering, isn't that reason enough? Kale was silent for a long moment, then he said, in my culture, such a gift creates a bond that cannot be broken. If you give me your eyes, you become family to House Seventh. Connection deeper than marriage, beyond friendship. You would be giving me not just sight, but a debt that could never be repaid. Emily smiled. I'm not asking for repayment. I'm asking you to see the stars and tell me if they're as beautiful as everyone says. The surgery was scheduled for the next cycle. Emily spent the time before it saying goodbye to sights she had taken for granted. She watched the sunrise through the station's observation dome, stared at her own face in the mirror for nearly an hour, memorizing every detail. She read books with her eyes instead of listening to audio, savoring the look of text on a screen. She visited the garden sector and studied the colors of flowers whose names she had never bothered to learn. Her friends and colleagues were supportive, but clearly thought she had lost her mind. Only shards of morning light seemed to understand the crystalline being found her the night before surgery, refracting light in patterns that almost looked like a human smile. Shard said, what you're doing is very human. Emily raised an eyebrow. Is that a compliment or an observation? Both. Shards chanted. Other species would calculate the cost, weigh the benefits, consider the logical outcomes. Humans just ask if they can help and then do it. Consequences be damned. It's terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. Emily laughed softly. I'm terrified too. If that helps, it would be strange if you weren't. Shards replied, but you're doing it anyway. That's what makes it brave. The surgery took 14 hours. Emily went under anesthesia, still seeing the concerned faces of the medical team, and woke to absolute darkness. For a moment, panic seized her, the reality of what she had done crashing down like a physical weight she could not see, would not see, might never see again. Then she heard Frost's voice. Emily, the surgery was successful. Both transplants took. Prince Kale is in recovery, and initial neural integration looks promising. Emily forced herself to breathe slowly. And me, your optic nerves were cleanly severed and sealed, no complications. The cloning process for your replacement eyes has begun, but as we discussed, it will be years before we know if it will work. Emily nodded, then realized the gesture might not be visible, and said, I understand. The first weeks were harder than she had anticipated. Everything was darkness, complete and absolute. She had to learn to navigate by touch and sound, to build mental maps. Like Kale had done, simple tasks became monumental challenges. Eating without seeing her food, getting dressed without seeing her clothes, moving through familiar corridors that were now alien and treacherous. But the Concordance medical staff rallied around her. They brought in specialists to teach her navigation techniques, installed audio description systems throughout her quarters, assigned a companion bot to help with daily tasks. Shards of morning light visited daily, describing the view from the observation deck in painstaking detail, trying to be Emily's eyes the way Emily had once offered to be Kess. And then on the 18th day after the surgery, something impossible happened. Emily woke from sleep and she could see. Not like before, not with her eyes. She had no eyes, just sealed skin where they had been, but she could perceive something, a strange ethereal awareness of the space around her. She sensed the walls of her room, the furniture. They faint electromagnetic signatures of the station systems humming through the bulkheads. She sat up in shock, and the perception intensified. She could sense the life signs of beings in nearby rooms, the heat bloom of the environmental systems, the quantum flutter of the station's shield generators 6 decks away. It was not sight as she had known it, but it was not blindness either. Frost nearly dropped her medical scanner when Emily described it. That's impossible, the doctor said. You don't have the neural structures for that kind of perception. Humans can't sense quantum signatures or electromagnetic fields. We simply don't have the organs. Emily smiled into the darkness. Then how am I doing it? The tests began immediately. Emily was subjected to every scan the concordance could devise, and the results were unprecedented. Somehow, impossibly, she had developed a connection to Cale's visual cortex. The transplanted eyes had created a quantum entanglement between their neural systems, a phenomenon that should not exist but undeniably did. She was seeing through his eyes, perceiving what he perceived, but filtered through her human consciousness in a way that created an entirely new form of sensation. When they brought Cale to her room, both of them were trembling. He said, I've been seeing things I cannot explain, memories that are not mine, places I have never been, colors that exist in spectrums I should not be able to perceive, earth meadows and ocean sunsets, and the face of a woman I have never met but somehow know. Your face, he added quietly. I've been seeing your memories of your own face. Emily felt tears. She could not cry, sliding down cheeks that could no longer produce them. And I've been sensing the quantum foam, she whispered, the probability clouds, the electromagnetic symphony, things I shouldn't be able to perceive, but somehow I'm experiencing them through you. The xenobiologists were fascinated. This was unprecedented in all of Concordance medical history. The transplant had not just given Cale human vision. It had created a permanent quantum link between their consciousnesses, allowing them to share perceptions across the gulf of their different biologies. Frost explained it in terms Emily could barely understand. The eyes are quantum entangled with both your neural signatures, she said. When Prince Cale sees something, the information is processed by his Valyrian brain, but because the eyes originated from you, there's an echo that resonates back through the quantum link. You're experiencing a translated version of his enhanced perception, so I'm not really seeing, Emily said. Frost shook her head. You're seeing in a way no human ever has before. You're perceiving reality the way a Valoran does, filtered through human consciousness. It's a completely new form of sensory input. Over the following weeks, Emily and Cale learned to navigate their strange new connection. He described to her what he saw with her eyes, the limited but precious human spectrum of visible light, the way colors looked flat and simple compared to Valyrian perception, but held their own unique beauty. She tried to explain to him what she sensed through their link, the overwhelming richness of quantum reality that her brain could barely process. They spent hours together in the observation deck. Cale would look at the stars with her eyes and describe them in words, while Emily sensed through their connection the deeper reality he perceived. Gravitational wells, the radiation storms, the quantum fluctuations that made each star a living thing in ways she had never imagined. One evening, several months after the surgery, Cale turned to her in that observation deck. He had learned to move with confidence. Now no longer hesitant or careful, her eyes had given him that. He said, "I need to tell you something. The bond between us, it's stronger than I anticipated. In Valoran culture, what we're experiencing would be considered soul link, a connection that transcends physical form. You're not just family to House Seventh anymore. You're part of me and I'm part of you." Emily smiled toward where she sensed him standing. "Is that a problem?" Kale and LT Unk and GT's skin shifted. Through colors she could somehow perceive through their link, emotions. She had learned to read. "No," he said softly, "it's a gift I never expected. You gave me sight, but you also gave me something more precious. You gave me connection to a form of being I would never have experienced otherwise. Through you, I understand humanity in a way no Valoran ever has, and through you," Emily said, "I perceive the universe in ways no human was meant to." "I'd say that makes us even," he laughed. "A sound like crystal chimes, very human of you to think a gift can be repaid. But I'm learning that perhaps that's not the point." The Concordance decided to release their story to the public, and the reaction was overwhelming. 17 different species broadcasted across their networks. The idea that a human would willingly blind herself for an alien, and that the result would be a new form of perception that transcended both species, captured the imagination of the galaxy. Humans, of course, were both proud and embarrassed, proud that one of their own had shown such compassion, embarrassed that it took an alien perspective to make them realize how remarkable it was. The Valyrian Empire, initially skeptical of accepting such a primitive sacrifice for their prince, began to see Emily's gift in a new light. Here was a species that would give everything for a stranger, not out of duty or obligation, but simply because they could help. The political implications were significant. The Valyrian Empire, which had maintained polite but distant relations with humanity, began opening new diplomatic channels. Prince Kale, who had been a tragic figure kept quietly out of public view, became an ambassador of sorts, touring Concordant stations with Emily at his side, demonstrating the possibilities that came from cross-species cooperation. But for Emily and Kale, the politics were secondary. They were exploring something far more interesting: the nature of consciousness itself, the boundaries of perception, the question of what it meant to see and be seen. Emily's quantum perception continued to develop. She learned to sense emotional states in the beings around her, to navigate complex spaces, using electromagnetic mapping to perceive the fundamental forces that most species could only detect with instruments. She would never have her physical eyes back. The cloning process had failed, as the doctors had warned it might, but she found she did not mourn them as much as she had expected. She was seeing just in a way she had never imagined possible. One day, nearly 2 years after the surgery, Emily stood in the observation deck alone. She sensed Kale approaching before he arrived, felt the familiar quantum signature that was as recognizable to her now as a face had once been. He stood beside her in comfortable silence. Then he said, "I've been thinking about that first conversation we had here, when you asked me what I sensed facing the stars." Emily turned toward him. "And what do you sense now?" Kale was quiet for a moment. "Beauty," he said finally. "Through your eyes I see their light, simple and pure through my own perception I sense. Their fundamental nature, the quantum dance of nuclear fusion and gravitational collapse, but the most beautiful thing, he continued, is knowing that I'm sharing this with you, that you're perceiving through me even as I see through you. It makes the universe feel less empty. Emily felt the quantum echo of his emotions through their link, genuine gratitude and affection that needed no translation. She said, "You know, when I made the decision to give you my eyes, I thought I was losing something. I thought I was making a noble sacrifice, giving up sight for darkness, but I was wrong." "How so?" Cale asked. "I didn't lose anything," Emily explained. "I transformed. I gave you one way of seeing and gained another. I'm not blind, Cale. I'm perceiving reality, ways I never dreamed possible. And yes, I miss colors sometimes, miss seeing faces the old way, but what I have now is extraordinary." Cale's hand found hers, a gesture he had learned from humans. "So you don't regret it?" Emily laughed softly. "Not for a single moment. You asked me once I would do this for you. The truth is, I did it because I believed seeing the stars would make you happy. I never imagined it would make me happy too, just in a completely different way." They stood together, human and Valorant, looking at stars through eyes that belonged to both, and neither of them. Around them, the Concordant station hummed with life. Hundreds of species coexisting, learning from each other, building something greater than any one civilization could achieve alone. The Galactic Council eventually commissioned a study on their case. Xenobiologists from 40 different species collaborated on research into the quantum neural link between Emily and Cale. What they discovered was profound. The phenomenon was not unique to them, but rather demonstrated a fundamental principle of consciousness that had been overlooked. Different species perceived reality through different filters, but at the quantum level, consciousness itself was universal. Emily and Cale had proven that barriers between species were not absolute, that with enough courage and compassion, beings could literally share perspectives across the gulf of biology. The research led to breakthroughs in cross-species medicine, psychology, and philosophy. New therapies were developed based on the quantum linking principle. Species that had considered themselves incompatible began to reconsider, and at the center of it all was a simple act. Human nurse who gave her eyes to an alien prince because she could, because he needed them, because helping was what humans did. Emily continued working in medical. Though her role evolved, she could not perform surgeries without sight, but her quantum perception made her invaluable in diagnostics. She could sense disease at the cellular level, detect emotional trauma through electromagnetic patterns, perceive the subtle quantum signatures that indicated incompatibility or rejection in transplant patients. She became the Concordance's foremost expert in cross-species neural integration. Cale, meanwhile, used his new sight to transform Valyrian art. He created works that combined human visual aesthetics with Valyrian quantum perception, pieces that could be experienced on multiple sensory levels. His exhibitions drew millions across the galaxy, beings who wanted to glimpse the universe through the unique perspective of someone who had been blind and now saw through human eyes while retaining Valyrian consciousness. But their greatest achievement was simpler than research, breakthroughs, or artistic innovations. It was the relationship itself, the bond they had forged across species lines, the proof that consciousness could transcend biology when compassion opened the door. 5 years after the surgery, Emily received a message from Earth. Her family had seen the broadcasts, read the articles, watch the interviews. Her mother's message was simple and made her cry tears she still could not shed. The message said, "We always knew you had a gift for caring, but we never imagined you would give so much. We're proud of you, sweetheart, proud and humbled. You've shown the galaxy what humanity is capable of." Emily played the message for Cale, and through their link she felt him experiencing the emotions of it, with her understanding human familial love in a way few Valorans ever could. He said, "Your species is remarkable. You know, individually fragile, cosmically young, technologically primitive by the standards of elder races, but you have something that centuries of advancement have caused many species to forget." "What's that?" Emily asked. "You remember that compassion is not a weakness," Cale said. "You give freely, sacrifice willingly, help without calculation of cost or benefit. It's inefficient, illogical by pure reason, and absolutely beautiful." Emily smiled. "We're working on the efficiency thing. Give us a few more centuries." Cale laughed. "Please don't. The galaxy needs humans exactly as you are." They stood in their familiar spot on the observation deck, watching stars through shared perception. Other beings passed by, various species going about their lives on the Concordance station, and Emily sensed the quantum signatures of each one, the beautiful diversity of consciousness that filled the galaxy. She thought about the moment she had agreed to the surgery, standing in a medical bay and saying yes to blindness without truly understanding what she was offering or what she would receive in return. It had seemed like such a simple decision at the time: help someone because you can, but that simple decision had rippled outward in ways she never anticipated. It had changed medical science, transformed diplomatic relations, created new art forms, and proven that the boundaries between species were more fluid than anyone had believed. And personally, it had given her something she had not even known she was missing: a connection to another consciousness so profound that sight itself became secondary to the understanding they shared. The observation deck's lights dimmed for night cycle, and Emily perceived the change not through darkening vision, but through the shift in electromagnetic patterns, the reduction in photon density, the way the quantum foam itself seemed to settle into stillness. It was beautiful in ways she could never have explained to her former self. Kel said quietly, "I was thinking about our first conversation here. You offered to describe the stars to me. I remember." Emily said, "I think I'm finally able to return the favor." Cale continued, "Through your human eyes, I see them as points of light, distant and beautiful. But through my Valyrian perception, through what you now share with me, I sense them as what they truly are: massive fusion engines warping space-time itself, creating the heavy elements that make life possible, burning for billions of years in a universe that would be cold and dark without them. They're not just beautiful, Emily, they're miracles. Every single one." Emily felt the truth of it through their connection, experienced his awe and wonder as if it were her own. "And what do you think?" she asked. "Are they as beautiful as everyone says?" "More," Cale said. "Simply so much more, especially because I can share them with you. The Concordance Station continued its eternal rotation, carrying its cargo of diverse life through the void. In medical bays, beings from H100 worlds healed under the care of professionals who had learned from Emily's example. In diplomatic halls, species negotiated with new understanding of what cooperation could achieve. In research lab, scientists explored the frontiers of consciousness, building on foundations laid by a human and a Valoran who had proven that perception itself was negotiable. And in the observation deck, two beings stood together, looking at stars through eyes that had been a gift freely given and a miracle freely received. They did not speak, did not need to. Through the quantum link that bound them, they shared the moment in ways that transcended language. Emily had given her eyes to a blind alien prince. In return, she had received a new way of seeing, a connection that spanned species and proof that humanity's greatest strength was not in technology or power, but in the simple willingness to help, to give, to sacrifice for others without counting the cost. The stars burned on, ancient and eternal, and two beings who should have been separated by biology, by culture, by the very nature of their different forms of consciousness, perceived them together, proving that compassion could bridge any gulf, that kindness created connections stronger than any force in the universe, and that sometimes in giving everything, you received more than you ever lost. Emily Parker had been nobody special, just a human nurse working in a medical bay, but she had made a choice that changed the galaxy's understanding of what was possible. She had given her sight and gained vision. She had lost her eyes and learned to see through stars, and in doing so she had shown the universe what humans did best. They helped, they gave, they sacrificed, not because they had to, but because they could, because someone needed it, because it was the right thing to do. That was humanity, messy and emotional, and illogical and absolutely undeniably beautiful, and that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, and I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug and see you in the next.